A quick mic check. We'll be looking to start our web securing Microsoft 365 in 1 minute. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining our event, Securing Microsoft 365. I'm Hugh Valentine from Valto, a Microsoft 365 specialist. And today we're going to be looking to cover off the following key areas. So the first thing we're going to cover is around the Microsoft 365 licensing. There's been a few changes to this recently, and we're just going to cover off how those changes work and what that means for the security aspects. We're then going to jump into a section around baseline security. So the baseline security is what we're able to do with Office 365 without any additional security add-ons. We'll then move on how we can control access to Microsoft 365. We'll discuss classifying, encrypting, and protecting key data that sits in the Microsoft 365 platform. We'll go over the device management tools that are available. We'll cover off advanced protection, so some of the additional add-ons that are available. And we'll also cover off something new called Azure Sentinel. The technologies that we're looking to explore are around the Microsoft 365 licensing, the security and compliance, Azure AD Premium, Intune, Azure Information Protection, Windows Defender ATP, and Azure Sentinel. So we'll be covering off all of those today as we go through our presentation. So the licensing that's available for Microsoft 365, there's been a few name changes recently, and as you'll see at the bottom, we have a blog post that details these changes on our webpage. So we've done a detailed blog post and a nice table, an Excel document that clearly outlines the features and functionalities that are available. So if you want to get more information on this, go onto our blog and we can cover that off there. Now, the first license has now been called Microsoft 365 Business Basic. This is formerly the license that was called Office 365 Business Essentials. So effectively, this license includes all of the Office 365 tools such as SharePoint, Exchange, Power Apps, Teams, but it doesn't include the ability to install Microsoft Office. We then have the Microsoft 365 Business Standard license. This is the one that was formerly called Office 365 Business Premium. And this is the same. It includes all of the tools for SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, but it also includes the capability to install Office on any device. So you can install that Office client on up to 5 devices and mobiles and tablets. The newest license, which was formerly called Microsoft 365 Business, has now been renamed to Microsoft 365 Business Premium. So if you're an organization that's less than 300 users and you're currently on the Microsoft 365 standard plan, you'll almost certainly want to look at upgrading to the Microsoft 365 Business Premium. Now, the reason for this is it includes everything that Business Standard includes, the ability to install an Office client, the actual tools available, but it has some key improvements. So the first one of those improvements is the actual Office client can be installed on remote desktop environments, and it also supports Windows Virtual Desktop. So this is really key because a lot of organizations in the past have used Office 365 E3 because that included the Office client that allowed them to use it on remote environments like RDS. Now we've got this in Business Premium. you could actually make a cost saving of about £2 a user a month and get the additional security tools that you don't get with Office 365 E3. The other thing we get is the security tools themselves. So we're going to be covering those off in detail today. Azure AD P1, Azure Information Protection, Intune, and a few other products that we'll go through. And we also have an upgrade to Windows 10 Business. So this provides some more enhanced security features and functionality that you can deploy, and it allows you to upgrade from Windows 7 or 8 Pro to Windows 10 Business. So if you're currently on a legacy version of Windows, you could upgrade for that with this plan as well. Of note is if anybody who isn't using Office 365 currently, you can actually get the Office 365 E1 license free for 6 months. So it doesn't include the security tools, but it might be useful if you're looking to try and get on board with that. If you're over 300 users, we've then got the Microsoft 365 E3 plan and the Microsoft 365 E5 plan. So these basically include the same security tools, but they include some more enhanced functionality. And basically the Microsoft 365 E5 includes absolutely everything that's available. So the first thing that I wanted to cover off is what is available to us out of the box. So if I don't have a security add-on such as EM&S or Microsoft 365 Business Premium, what can I do to secure my environment? And what we're going to do is we're just going to go into a live demonstration and show exactly how these tools work and where you can find them. So the very first thing that we can do with Microsoft 365 without a security add-on is we can come into the administration section here and we can actually jump into a section here that's called Multifactor Authentication. So what you can do on every Office 365 environment, completely free, is switch on Multifactor Authentication. And what this does basically is allows us to simply toggle that this user should have MFA switched on or off. Now, MFA can have a relatively big impact for users. So what MFA basically means is when a user signs in to Office 365 with their username and password, they will receive a secondary prompt, usually on their mobile phone. So when I sign in with my username and password, as an example, I will receive an additional prompt that then asks me to confirm my identity. So I'll just show you this very briefly. So effectively, I can get my password and put that into the platform. And what will happen is, as I then sign into this platform, it'll then ask for my password, which I can put into here. And you'll see now that it's asking me to approve my request. So on my mobile phone now, I've got a pop-up notification using something called the Microsoft Authenticator app, and I can actually approve that sign-in and say, trust me for 30 days. So by trusting this device for 30 days, I won't get an additional prompt. So effectively, MFA is very, very powerful, and it can stop 99.9% of attacks. So by switching this on, you're very much hardening your environment. As a classic example, if someone was to accidentally put a phishing email address and put their username and password in, without MFA, that phishing attack would be successful and they would be able to log into your account and then make changes on your behalf. With MFA enabled, they would still have the password, but they wouldn't be able to sign in without that secondary prompt. So it's very, very powerful what we can do with this. Now, what it does have is a bit of an administration overhead. So as an example, if I have users that don't have mobile phones, so you might have a lot of deskless workers, perhaps cleaners or volunteers in your organization, and switching the MFA on can be a bit of an onerous task. They might not want to use their personal phone, and they might have basically concerns about enabling this functionality. So as we go through some of the enhanced functions and tools that are available later today, we'll cover off how that works and what we can do from that perspective. Within the service settings, we can also basically enable the settings for multi-factor authentication. So as an example here, I can choose trusted IPs. This isn't great because it just literally locks down your environment to be able to say only you can access it from this environment. I can also choose the methods available to users. So I can choose whether to enable calling, text message, applications, and I can also choose how long they can trust that device for. So you can enable that from 1 to 60 days. The downsides again of this are that I have to remember to switch it on for each user. So if I forget to do that, you potentially have a security hole. So it's a bit of an administration task from that perspective. Another tool that we have available to us is within the admin center, we have a security and a compliance section. So within the security section, there's a range of tools that are available. And one of those key tools that we have here is something called Microsoft Secure Score. So you'll see here we've got a ranking of what our score is that's been improving over time. And then we've got some metrics about what we're actually improving on. If we click on the Microsoft Secure Score, that takes me to a page where I'm able to sign up and I can see all of the recommendations that this makes. So by having this switched on, it basically, you can determine what actions you should be looking to do. So turning MFA on for each user, do not expire passwords, enable self-service password reset. So it's basically making recommendations of where we should be enabling features and functions. And then it's giving us a score of how we rank by doing those changes. So this is a very key tool, and it will also identify when you've got additional add-ons. So some of these add-ons are only available when you have an Azure ADP too. So perhaps not all of the features that you would have available are in your current license plan. You might need to look to purchase additional ones. But the secure score basically provides an overview of where you're currently at, a list of improvement actions. So basically where you can improve and what you need to do. You can see the history of those changes and when your scores improved or regressed. And we can then see some metrics where other organizations fit. So you can see we're above the rank. We're not perfect in this demo environment, but we're certainly not where other organizations are sitting. So the Secure Score is a free tool that's available in all Office 365 environments, and it'll give you a good overview of the features and functionality that are available. So that can be found in protection.office.com. Another really fantastic tool that we have is called the Audit Log Search. So by default, this is now switched on, but if you have an older Office 365 environment, you might find that this isn't currently enabled. So you need to click on Audit Log Search, and then this will switch that functionality on and make it available. Now what it does is if I hit the search button here, it's basically tracking all of the changes that has happened to Office 365. So pretty much every single change that's occurred. It takes a minute to load up as it's getting all the data. And now we can see here all of the actions that the employees at the organization have been doing. So for example, Kieran's been creating a lot of folders. And we can actually then break down and search on specific activities. So perhaps if I wanted to check if someone had recently changed their permissions to an Exchange mailbox, I can see all of the Exchange mailbox activities, and then I can do another search on there. So this is a very, very powerful tool that basically is keeping track of absolutely everything that's going on in the environment, and we can then go back and see what's been done. This is kept for 90 days. So if perhaps as an organization you need to keep this data for longer, there is some tools like Azure Sentinel, which we'll talk about at the end, but this log will only keep things that are 90 days and older. So you might need to, if you've had a breach as an example, it's a good idea to try and gather that information as quickly as you possibly can. We've then got some additional tools around that are available in the Microsoft 365 tool set. So the baseline security that I've covered off, we basically have 3 key areas that are useful for organizations to look at. The multi-factor authentication, which can be switched on or off for all the users, but the side effects of that are it can be a bit of an administration nightmare because we can only switch it on or off. We don't have any other controls around that. We then had Secure Score, which basically gives you a ranking of where your Office 365 environment currently sits and what points you've got for that environment. We've also then got the audit log itself, which is tracking all of the changes, and it's very handy perhaps if you've had a breach and you want to see what's happened, you can go back and look at that. The next thing that we want to look at is how can we control access to Microsoft 365. So by default, Office 365 can be accessed on any PC, on any location, and any device. So what that means is it's fantastic from a usability perspective. It means your users can simply log on to any device and they can start to get access to things. But actually from a IT standpoint, that isn't actually all that great because you have no control. If they're logging on their home PC, you don't know if they have malware on that home PC. You don't know if they're logging in on the home PC to steal your information. So what we actually really want to do is look at controlling how people can access Office 365. And the way we do that is using something that's included in the Microsoft 365 Business Premium license, a product called Azure AD P1. So you can see if you're at what level your Active Directory tenant is at by going to the Administration Center and picking the Azure Active Directory option here. And you'll see here that our tenant is currently enabled for, just bear with me, Azure AD P2. So that means we've got the highest level we can. The Business Premium includes Azure AD P1, and there's some minor features that are enabled in this. I'd recommend you look at our blog post I mentioned if you want to see exactly what's included in each one. Now, within here on Azure AD, we have a security section. And one of the key tools that we have is this one here called Conditional Access. So Conditional Access basically lets us define exactly how an environment can be accessed on Office 365. So you can see here we've got a number of our Valto policies that we've enabled. The first one we have here is called a trusted location MFA. So what this policy basically does is as I go into the settings here, you can see we've got different ways of assigning this. So we can assign it to users and groups. We can assign it to specific cloud apps. So we could build a policy that only applies to SharePoint or a policy that only applies to Exchange. And we can then define conditions. So our trusted location MFA is basically saying for all users, regardless of who they are or what they do, excluding specific users in here, like a break glass account and my admin account, and also excluding guest accounts as well. So this policy is basically going to apply to everyone that isn't in that exclusion. We've then got all cloud apps. So this will apply to absolutely everybody. Every application, Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, and we then have conditions here. So the conditions are basically saying we're going to basically block any location, or we're going to require MFA for any location, excluding our trusted locations. So in effect, what this policy is doing is it's saying if someone is logging in from a non-trusted location, so not the head office or any of our other sites that we have, then they will require an MFA prompt. So this means that we have a blanket enable of MFA, and it can help reduce the administration that I mentioned earlier. And what it does, that means if a cleaner who should only really need to access your Exchange emails and SharePoint while they're actually at your site, that would mean that they don't need to MFA because they're accessing it from a trusted location. So it removes a lot of the administration overheads that MFA can impose. And it also means that we don't have to worry about switching MFA on manually anymore because we've got this blanket enabled for MFA. So regardless of what I set in the other admin center, regardless of what this says here, with this account here says disabled, this conditional access policy is overwriting that and saying this is applying to all users. And then at the bottom, we've got the ability to say grant. So what we can actually do is say we can actually require them for multi-factor authentication, or we can require the device to be marked as compliant. I could require both if I wanted at the bottom. But what this means is as we go through later, we can use something called Intune to actually identify a work PC and ensure it meets our policies. So for this policy, in summary, what we're saying is if they're coming into a trusted location, they don't have to MFA. If they're at a non-trusted location, such as home, they have to MFA or they have to have a work-issued compliant device. So this policy basically is enabling MFA across our environment and then excluding those scenarios. We can also do different things with these policies. So we can do, for example, block legacy authentication. So recently, Microsoft enabled something called modern authentication, which is when you're signing into Outlook and Teams, it supports MFA. So it basically enables you to have an MFA prompt. Legacy authentication, you may have seen something called app passwords, which it allows you to create. They're basically like a backdoor where the MFA prompt doesn't work. So you can create an app password that allows an app to just access it on a one-time basis. So they're not really a great method of security. So we can actually block those. We've got a couple of other policies here. Restrict risky countries. So if you guys don't operate in countries like China and Brazil and India, then we might as well block those risky countries, because we see a lot of environments that are constantly getting sign-in attempts from those countries. So we might as well block them altogether. It doesn't stop them from using a VPN and stuff, but it might stop a big portion of people that are trying to sign in. We've then got two here, block non-compliant devices. So this basically is a policy that can block home PCs. So if we don't want that salesperson logging in on a home PC, we can block it, and then we know that they're secure. Or we don't want somebody just generally doesn't need to access their data on a home PC. We can just use this block. Restrict non-compliant devices is similar, but it basically allows us to restrict what they can do. So they could still sign in. They would require an MFA prompt, but what this then actually enables them to do is say, I'm going to put it into a limited mode. So they could say, I'm not able to download any documents. I'm not allowed to connect the Outlook client, but I could edit documents in the web browser and I can do that kind of thing. So effectively what that means is I'm able to do anything around that and restrict them if they are needing to log in on a home PC. And of course, all of these policies are then able to just sign in and apply to different groups. So you might have a management group where they can sign in on a home PC, and you might have an office-bound user group which can only sign in on their work-issued device. So the conditional access tool is very, very powerful. And some of the cool things that we've got, for an example, we only enforce the Outlook app, so we don't allow users to use the Mail application on their phone. So that just basically means it limits, it gives us some more security controls, which I'll show later on. And we enforce the Outlook client on devices as well. So if they're using things like a Mac-enabled client or Windows Mail, we block that just because they don't have as much security controls as we'd like. And the other thing that we can actually do now, which is kind of a new feature, is we can enable policies for report only. So this basically can do absolutely nothing, but we can then track whether that policy is working as intended or not. So the conditional access side of things is a very, very powerful feature, and it gives us a lot of controls around what we can do from controlling how Office 365 can be accessed. Within Azure AD Premium as well, we also have a section here called Enterprise Application. Now, Enterprise Applications basically enables us to create a new application. So I can either, if I'm developing an app and I want to use Azure AD with it, I can choose this option. If I have some legacy on-premise applications that are using SAML and I want to sign in with Office 365, I can do that. And all of the pretty much 3,453 cloud applications are available in here. And what this basically means is if, as an organization, we use DocuSign, and I want to replace the sign-in credentials for DocuSign. So what this will do is it will say you no longer have a separate username for DocuSign. What you will do, and as a live example of that, we have a product that we use called Screen Connect, which we use to help provide remote connectivity. Screen Connect has its normal username and password here, and I'm able to sign in. But I've also got this new option that's appeared at the bottom, which is called Connect with Azure AD. When I click on that, it's determined I've already signed in. So that basically knows I've already signed into Office 365, and it's given me access. If I don't have a sign in, it would basically prompt me to say, as another example, if we do that again, and I connect with Azure AD, I get the standard Office 365 login box. So it basically gives us a way of accessing Office 365 signing in with Office 365 credentials. So if you think from an IT administration perspective, it means that we don't have to have lots of usernames and passwords scattered around all over the place. And then when someone leaves the business, IT don't have to remember to go shut them down in loads of areas. It replaces those sign-in with them. So effectively, as an organization, we have 3 groups that drive all of the permissions, and based on the people being in those groups gives them access to our various applications such as Google, Screen Connect, Zendesk, that kind of thing. So that's kind of a key area, which is around replacing the sign-ins. Another thing that I'd like to recommend to organizations is to enable some company branding. So if we're on the Office 365 homepage, you'll notice that we've got our logo on the sign-in page, and we've also got a branded Chester logo in the background as well. So what that basically means is we can train our users to say, if you see a phishing attack and you don't see our login information like this, do not sign into that password. So it effectively means we can control, would just train the users to understand that they need to see this and not the typical Office 365 sign-in page. And it just makes it a bit easier from that perspective. So that's kind of the key ways that we can control access to Microsoft 365. We've got the conditional access tool, which lets us build all kinds of rules on how people can access it. And then we've got the single sign-on tool, which enables us to then define specific rules on how people can use third-party applications like Screen Connect, Zendesk, and HR systems you might have. The next section that we're going to look at is classify, encrypt, and protect. So this is all about, once you have your data in Office 365, what tools are available to me to basically protect that data. So if we go back to the admin center, we've got a section here called security and compliance. If we were to jump into the security section, there is a few different portals floating around at the moment. They're working on a new portal, and it can be a bit of a fiddle, but if you go to protection.office.com, you'll get to the same portal that I'm showing now. Now, under the classification section, we've got 2 types of labels. The first one we have is called retention labels. So retention labels basically allow us to define how long content that's stored in SharePoint, OneDrive, and Outlook should be kept for. So it stops users from being able to permanently delete that file, and it automatically allows you to automate the deletion of data when it reaches a certain age. So as an example, I've got a CVs area here, and the CVs one basically is saying when a file that's classified with a CV hits 2 months, we want to delete it, and it's based on when that document was created. So anything that's been applied to this label, which is called CVs, will automatically get deleted after the 2-month period. We've then got one called finance. So what the finance label is doing is saying protect that data for 7 years. So what it's saying is don't allow users to delete it, preserve it. After 7 years, we then want to go through a review process. So email all of the reviewers, which could be a group of people, to say it's time to review this document. And then after that, they can decide then to delete it once it's been approved. And what that looks like is if I click on Explore Items, we've got a view to show all the areas that are classified with that label. So Exchange ones, SharePoint ones. We can actually see all the items that are classified with it. So I can jump into a SharePoint location where this file's been classified. And then we've got the pending disposition. So when those files do reach the 7-year period, it's 7 years, so none of them have reached that age yet. What we can then do is choose dispose, which will basically get rid of the file. We can choose extend, which will extend the label. So we could say, well, I'm going to keep it for another year, or we could relabel that. So you might decide we're going to actually use it for a bit longer, and we can export that out as well if you needed to move it into another system. So the reviewing area allows us to basically dispose, extend, relabel, or export that data out. So the retention side of things is obviously very, very key, and customers generally use those for things like, as I've got my CVs example, I've got my finance example, which is basically all of the financial information, and you could use it for personal and customer data as well. So it's particularly handy if you've got like a really large projects area and you need to start purging off the old projects after 7 years, you can do that and automate some of those requirements there. We've also got sensitivity labels. So sensitivity labels basically allow us to decide on labels that are going to be used to protect data and protect information. So you can see we've got all these labels here. But what that actually means is if I jump into a Word file quickly, when I've got this enabled, I've actually got a new sensitivity tag in Word, Excel, Outlook, all of those kind of applications. And what I can actually do is I can flag this file to say it's finance only. So if you call this document salary info and scroll down, because this file has been tagged as finance only, it's got a watermark that says finance, and it's also can have a footer as well. So if I change this to internal, we've got an internal only, or again, I can change it to highly confidential, and you can put a footer on there as well. Now, the whole idea of these labels is we can put rules around them. So with a traditional file server, if you have permission to the finance salary folder, you could copy those files to a USB stick, or you could email them to somebody, and that protection wouldn't live with the document. It would, as soon as you've got access and copied them, that generally means that other people can have access to them. With this document now will always check in the Office 365 Azure Information Protection Service. And what the internal label basically will do is check if I have a Valto email address. So if I was to send this externally to somebody, because it's internal only, they will not be able to open that document, and it will say it's an internal only document. I could do the same as internal documents as well. So I could have a group of people in finance, and I could say this salary information is finance only. So nobody else would be able to access that. So it can protect external facing information and also internal facing information. Now, I always use an example of where this could be really powerful is if you have a company that has two employees with the same name. We might have Dave Jones, the head director, the managing director, and we might have Dave Jones, who's recently joined, and they're the cleaner. So what can happen is, as finance are going to send this salary information over, they accidentally email it to the new Dave Jones, because that's a very easy mistake that can happen. Now, what this document will do is it will say, right, the Dave Jones, the cleaner, isn't in the finance only group, so it'll bounce his permissions back and he won't be able to access that document and therefore protect that data. Similarly, if I had a really sensitive internal email only, that was like our secret way of working, then I could flag this as internal only. And if someone then decided to send it off to somebody else, they would not be able to access that file. So the Azure Information Protection side of things is very, very powerful, and it gives us the capability of classifying labels and building basically policies around that. Most organizations only end up with less than 10 labels. They don't have thousands of them. They're generally things like internal only, public, management, that kind of thing is where the policies really sit. We can automatically apply different labels to different people. So obviously, if there was a directors only label, a normal employee that wouldn't even be able to see the director's information wouldn't need to see the director's label. So we can publish different groups of labels to different people. We can also do auto labeling. So something we'll talk about shortly is data loss prevention. But in essence, if we identified someone was sending a credit card number, we might want to automatically flag that as internal only, so they can't then send that to someone outside of the organization. So the auto labeling basically can build rules to say, if I detect this string, like a credit card number or perhaps a project reference or a customer reference, then we'll basically protect that information. We've also got a kind of back end to this portal. So the Azure Information Protection portal that exists in the Azure section. There's a really powerful tool that's called the Azure Scanning tool. And what that can do is it can scan a file server that's Windows Server 2012 and above, and it can go scan all of your documents, and it can classify those documents on the file server. So if you've got a lot of documents and you're looking to try and classify them based on keywords and protect them, we can use the scanning tool to be able to do that. Also within the admin center, we've got kind of usage reports and activity logs as well. So we can actually track who's been opening these documents and that kind of thing. So the other thing that we have in the data loss in the security and compliance section is basically the data loss prevention. So what we can do in here is we can apply different types of policies to our areas. So we can apply this to Exchange, SharePoint, Microsoft Teams. And effectively, if I create a new policy in here, you can see I can look for different types of data. So Microsoft have built some automatic detection templates where we could look for UK financial data. So if someone enters a credit card number or a EU debit number, or it could be, if we click on privacy, we could look for UK Data Protection Act, and we can find national insurance numbers and passport numbers, that kind of thing. So there's lots of stuff in here where we can identify that information. If we stick with UK financial data in here, we can call that UK financial data. We can apply this to everything: Exchange, Teams, Channels, OneDrive, SharePoint. And then what we can do is if we find the content, credit card number, and it's being shared outside of the organization, we can then build some rules. So we can say if someone's sending 10 instances, so if someone's trying to send 10 credit card numbers, we can then send an incident report to a group of people to check that that should be happening. We can lower this to 1, or we can increase it to 100. And we can also then restrict access or encrypt the content. So what this means is we could block them from sharing it. So you shouldn't be sending even one credit card number externally. So we'll block that. Or we can encrypt it. And that will then use the labels that I showed you in Azure Information Protection. So when that user does receive the credit card number, they will have to go through some additional security measures to actually be able to open that file. So the DLP is very good. It's good for if we're sending emails out, and it can stop people from maybe make them think whether they should be sending a credit card number out. But also in Microsoft Teams, if you have a team that's shared externally with external parties, and someone then decides to put a credit card number in for one of their co-workers, not realizing there's external people in there, it can also prevent that kind of data loss as well. So it's very handy across the whole of Microsoft 365 to prevent those data loss attacks. So those are kind of the key areas that we have for classifying, encrypting, and protecting data. Azure Information Protection, which really secures the data and stops people from sharing things they shouldn't. DLP, which has the built-in rules to detect credit card numbers, and you can build your own queries. And then retention, which can automate the deletion, retention of files and that kind of thing. The next section that we want to look at is device management. So built into the Microsoft 365 Business Premium licenses, we have a section within here called Microsoft Intune. So what Intune basically allows us to do is to basically protect pretty much any kind of device. So the first section we have here is device enrollment. So enrollment basically is if you have work issued devices like Apple devices, Android or Windows, and you want to then put policies on them and protect them, this is exactly what that's for. So Windows enrollment, we've got something called Autopilot. And this basically means we can automatically set up and configure a device. So instead of you having to receive the device at IT and then set that up and send it over to the user, we can actually ship that device straight to the user. They can sign in with their work credentials, and Autopilot then kicks in and configures the rest of the device. The kind of use cases for enrolling Apple and Android devices are you might issue an Apple device to people out in the field. You might have truck drivers, and you want to basically prevent them from using all of the data, or you want them to stop them installing their own custom applications. So we can enroll those kind of mobile and tablet devices to stop them from doing that kind of thing. It's not necessarily, if you're quite lax in terms of you give someone their own phone, but you want them the capability to install their own apps, you might not necessarily have to go through the full enrollment. So this is handy where you have specific requirements and you really want to lock the device down, but we'll cover something else off which is easier to configure called application management as well. So enrollment basically says, right, we're going to enroll these devices and then we have control of them. So for our Windows 10 devices, we can have then a compliance policy. So a compliance policy basically says, right, here's Valto's internal compliance policy. And we can see that all of the devices apart from one are currently compliant with the policy. So I can go into the properties, and our policy is basically saying we require BitLocker, we require a firewall to be enabled, we require a antivirus and anti-spyware to be switched on. And if for some reason those devices do not adhere to this standard, we mark them as non-compliant immediately. And if we think back to the conditional access policies I mentioned before, we could actually block devices from accessing Office 365 if they don't meet this policy. So what that means is we can then adhere to certain standards. And this would require, if the firewall or antivirus is switched off, we should manually intervene and actually see what's caused that. Is there a malware that's doing that? We've then got device configuration. So compliance is checking the device, whereas configuration is actually making changes to the device. So with the autopilot I mentioned before, we've got a load of policies here where we're deploying policies to our users' laptops. So for example, we're deploying Chrome, we're deploying OneDrive to a specific standard. We're enabling Microsoft Edge as the default browser because that's a much more secure browser now they've brought the new version out. We're deploying extensions that we want them to have. Even we've got favorites for our staff in the top left-hand corner within the browser. We're enabling the antivirus. We even do things like sync Microsoft Teams areas automatically for people and control the lock screen and that kind of thing. So these policies basically give us full control of those devices, knowing that they're set up to the standard that you require. So the configuration basically is make changes to help automatically deploy. We can also do things like software updates. So if I wanted to automatically deploy software updates to everybody in the organization, we can do that from here. And we can see all the devices are currently up to date. And finally, we've got this client app section. So the client app section basically allows us to deploy applications to different devices. So if we've got an iPhone enrolled, we could deploy these apps automatically. If we've got Android apps we want to roll out to users, we can do that. And we can also deploy applications to users' devices as well. So if we want to deploy an antivirus or Screen Connect and automatically roll that out to everybody, we've got Office 365 enrolled here. We can configure that policy to do that. We've also got app protection policies. So I mentioned these before. Not in you don't have to in all cases enroll devices. So we work with organizations who are perhaps issuing iPhones to their users, but they're not too bothered whether they install their own applications or what they do with those phones. They just want to protect their company data. So what app protection policies allow us to do is basically say, right, here's an iPhone app protection policy. Now, this is very handy for bringing your own devices as well. So if a user then installs any of these apps on that phone, on their personal phone or their work phone, we can say as soon as they sign in to Microsoft SharePoint or Microsoft OneDrive with a work email address and password, we're going to protect only the app. So we'll have no control over their phone. We couldn't wipe their phone or change their pictures or anything. But for the app specifically, we can stop them from backing it up into their personal area. We can encrypt the data so third-party apps can't access that data. We can stop them even from copying and pasting between apps. So if we didn't want them to be able to copy out of SharePoint into Dropbox, we can lock that down. And we can even then set a PIN for access. So we can say you have to have a PIN when you open the app, or you can use your Face ID or Touch ID as well. So it basically gives us a very high level of control of the apps on people's personal phones and also work phones if you want to do that. And if they then leave the business, we can then choose app selective wipe. So this can then wipe their apps off their phone and not touch any of their other personal information. So that's a very quick overview of Intune. It basically can manage pretty much any kind of device, and it gives us the capability then of controlling both enrolling it, putting compliance policies on there to check it's up to standard, and then putting configuration policies and deploying applications so it's adhering to your company standards. The next piece that we're going to cover off is around advanced protection. So there's a couple of things that are available as advanced add-ons. So if you go for the Microsoft 365 Business Premium option, within the protection.office.com, we actually have a section in here which is called policy. So under threat management, I've got one called policy, and this adds something called Office 365 ATP Plan 1. So what Office 365 ATP Plan 1 does is it basically provides 3 new types of policies. The first one is an anti-phishing policy. So this can be enabled, and it basically will identify phishing emails based on machine learning that Microsoft's developed, and then automatically quarantine those messages so the users can't even see them. What we can also do is we can put safety tips on. So if someone's using a weird character, so quite often we might see that instead of using an I, they're using like this symbol here. We can actually identify that and put a safety tip onto the user to say there's some unusual characters in here and some other anti-spoofing technology around here. So this basically gives us some tools that stop us from receiving phishing emails, and if they do manage to get through, alerting the user so that they might be phishing attempts. We've also got safe attachments. So safe attachments basically scans every attachment that comes into SharePoint and emails, and it basically then opens it in Microsoft's data center and says it scans that file and then makes sure that it's not doing anything malicious like trying to access the registry. If it passes that check, it then presents it to the user and they can open the attachment. And safe links basically prevents users from opening malicious links in a similar way to ATP safe attachments. So those are kind of key tools that are available for Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection. We also then have a product called Microsoft PIM, Privileged Identity Management. So what that basically means is we have a tool that's called Just-in-Time Administration. So again, with Office 365 has many roles. I'm able to have a global admin role, which basically gives me full control of absolutely everything in Office 365. Just-in-time administration, basically I can still have that role. So I'm still able to have the role global administration request. But what I can actually do in this platform is I can go into my roles. I can see here that I've got the global administration role, and I have to actually activate it on the far right-hand side here. And I can then basically give it some time of how long I need it for. I've currently got it enabled for this demo for everything, but I can basically say I need the global admin role enabling for 1 hour, 2 hours. I can put a reason in there, and I can even enable an approval process. So perhaps as head of IT, you want to get the final stamp on those changes before an engineer goes ahead. We can use this to basically manage that kind of aspect and enable those features. We can review the access. So that basically will allow us to go into there, and I can click on the portal's changed a little bit. So I'll just jump into the correct section. So if I jump into the Manage Azure AD Roles section, I can come into this view here, and I can see all of my roles that I currently have access to. I can activate those as required. I'm able to approve requests. So if my co-workers have approved those, and I can actually even do an access review. So an access review will check a group of users and determine whether they should have those roles. So this is kind of an automated way of saying we want to have a report that checks who's a global administrator every 60 days. So there's a lot of things perhaps in Cyber Essentials where you have to do these kind of access reviews, and this can automate that aspect for your organization as well. So privileged identity management basically allows us to, I can still have my global administration role, but when I actually want to use it, I have to actually request that and then approve that request before I'm able to make any changes. The last thing we want to cover from the development perspective is a product called Azure Sentinel. So I mentioned earlier that the audit logs for Azure are only kept for 90 days. So what we're actually able to do is we're able to use a third party, an add-on, which is called Azure Sentinel. It's part of Azure, and it's a pay-as-you-go use model. And what I can actually do within here is I can export all of the audit logs into a database that I can then access. So it basically means that if you need to have your data for much longer than 90 days, perhaps you have a legal obligation that you need to be able to trace things for 3 years, 7 years, which a lot of banks have to do. We can actually track all of those and keep the logs in this section. So if I go into the data connectors here, I can actually track loads of different kinds of services in here. So I can, for example, track Azure Active Directory logs. I can track Azure activity. I can track Citrix information. I can track Office 365 events. And this basically then stores all of the information into the database that we can then access. So I can use the incidents log, which basically you can build an incident. So perhaps an incident might be if someone escalates their permission, I want to log that as an incident so we can review it. Some people are creating workbook templates as well. So these are people that are basically building automatic alerts and dashboards for you. So this is kind of a new tool, but I think it's very interesting for organizations to basically start keeping track of all the logs that are going into the system. So I can see kind of all the data and I can start to report on that information. It used to be a platform that was called Operations Management Suite, but it's now moved into this platform and it basically gives us a full track of all the changes, and it's in a database type format where you can build reports and that kind of thing. So it's a very powerful tool for tracking the logs and keeping those longer than 90 days. And perhaps bringing them in centrally. So if you've got logs in Cisco, you've got logs in Azure, AWS, and you just want one login platform, you can bring this in and then build your dashboards that way. So that kind of concludes an overview of the tools that are available from a Microsoft 365 security perspective. A few other things. So we do a remote workshops. So if you're interested in doing a remote workshop, perhaps some of the security tools that we've been through today are of interest. We do a security workshop in which we go through all of the tools that I've showed today, and we come up with a specification and design of how these can be configured and a roadmap of how they will be delivered. So obviously everything I showed today would be fantastic, but you couldn't just push a button and have them on day one. So the aim of this workshop is to go through a roadmap approach to understand the tools in more detail and then configure them in a way that you would need. As part of our webinar of the remote working series, we're doing a building a power platform strategy, which is being run on the 11th of June with my colleague Dougie Wood. We're doing a new blog post today, which is a live case study of Medisys. So that's one of our clients that's been through this security process, and you'll be able to find that video on our YouTube channel. Just to stress, we've got this Microsoft 365 licensing overview blog post. So if you want to find out more about the licensing, go to our webpage and you can find out exactly what's included in each feature and license plan. There's some useful links. So all the videos we've been doing are available on our YouTube channel, which you can access here. We've got the Office 365 roadmap, which shows all of the upcoming changes and tools that are available. And we've got the Microsoft Security Center, which has a lot of useful information about these tools that you can dig into as well. We'll also be issuing a recording of this video, so that anybody that wasn't able to attend, we'll send a link to those. And for you guys, if you've got colleagues that you want to share this with, you'll definitely be able to do that as well. So we'll now move on to Q&As. So I can see that we've had quite a few questions that have popped in throughout the presentation. If people have more questions, feel free to post those now, and we'll answer those and go through those. So the first question we have from Martin is, can a sensitivity labels apply to PDFs also? So yeah, they can apply to everything pretty much. So you can apply them from a Windows Explorer view, and you can actually post those, put the sensitivity labels on pretty much any type of file format. Another question is, can we use FIDO2 passwordless authentication in Azure AD? So the answer to that is definitely yes. So if I was to log into our Office 365 environment and put my email address in, we have a option here, sign in with a security key, and that will then ask me to put my security key into the USB port and then authenticate me. So that feature is definitely available, and that's something that we've been using and testing, and it works really well. I've heard Microsoft will enable MFA by default for any new tenancy. I think there is some plans around that in the roadmap. So that link I mentioned about the roadmap would be useful. Do you recommend that passwords shouldn't expire, or would you say every 365 days is fine? I think it's kind of Microsoft's guidance now is to not have passwords expire at all, because it encourages users to basically change passwords to things that they don't remember and then they write them down. So having the password set to never expire will prevent that, but also having it set to something very high, like 365 days, I believe is also fine and would be a good policy. We can also enable self-service password reset. So if the users do forget their password, they can then reset their own passwords and go through that authentication process. Lots of questions coming in. Can MFA be applied to certain user groups only? So that's from Jason. So yeah, with conditional access, we can apply those policies to only a specific group or the entire organization. So it doesn't have to be limited to everybody. You're able to very much tailor that to specific people. Do compliance policies recognize non-Microsoft security apps? From Steve. No, they don't. But there is something called Cloud App Security, which is a tool that can integrate with your existing UTM on site, and that can be used for tracking and measuring things like DLP and shadow IT. So there is some options around that. The keys that I'd recommend, I'm going to send you an email to just get in touch, and I'll send you a link back on those for the FIDO security keys. So just get in touch and I'll send you those over. Is customer lockbox available on Business Premium? Unfortunately not. You have to have an E5 license for that, but you can have an E5 license for one user. So some of the features you might want to enable just for one or two users that need it rather than everybody. Just trying to go through the questions. There's some quite big ones in there. If people do have questions that I'm not able to answer, then please get in touch. If the document classified as finance only, can finance users download it and send it externally? So what I showed earlier is we can have a classification called finance only, and we can have multiple users within that label for finance. So you could have finance that are able to change and reclassify the label, and we could have a different group of people that could only read only. So we can, for each label, you can have administrators of the label, and you could then have normal users, and you can really define the permissions. So finance might be able to reclassify that before they need to send it out to somebody else. So that would definitely be possible. Can I view the user and admin logins by location in Microsoft 365 Business Basic? Yep, so in the Azure AD, there's an actual admin log that you can go to, and that will show all of the sign-ins. So I'll just show that very quickly. I can actually go into the Azure AD. I can click on users. I could find a user like myself, and I can then choose and jump into the sign-in section here, and I can see all of the sign-ins that are available and where I signed in and what conditional access policies were applied. So that's definitely possible. I think we've got time for one more question. So when using SAML, does the third-party application also have every user's user ID and password, and does a breach on third-party affect SAML? So no, the user it will not pass through the user identity to the other query. You're basically still hosting Office 365 and you're still using that as the logon place. You're not we're not passing any username and passwords to the third party. We're simply pointing to that new service from your third party application. Okay, so that's, I can see that there is a lot of questions. So if anybody wants to get in touch, email me, hugh@valto.co.uk, and I can definitely help you out and answer those questions. And thank you very much for attending. We'll be sending the video link out to this shortly. Thank you all. Bye.